Creating this coat has been an over a year-long process and it's finally finished. Well, aside from the fact that I still want to add intricate embroidery to the lapels, collar, and possibly the back waist belt strip piece called the half belt, this thing is done. Normally, tailoring a coat would take roughly a month to complete. Unfortunately, in my case, a month is never enough because I take on too many projects at one given time. I've documented the entire process of the sewing experience for my own personal intents and purposes, just so that I would have hours upon hours of footage to go through and use as reference if I ever choose to tailor again, and to maybe put together a shorter version, show what it takes to tailor a coat with you. So this is pretty much an entire walkthrough compiled into roughly 30 minutes. In addition to a few tailoring books that I've used to guide me in sewing this garment for the very first time, I had a very wonderful instructor named Linda Maynard who shared a lot of her knowledge and expertise, and I will include a link to her information down below as well as the links to the books I found helpful. So because I've never draped a coat before and I needed a pattern for a class when this whole thing began, I found a commercial pattern that I then adjusted to what I initially had in mind, and it is Vogue pattern B1562, I believe. I've transferred the pattern pieces onto Swedish transfer paper, excluded the seam allowance, and included my own personal alterations, while the pattern pieces for the lining have been completely ignored because in tailoring, the actual pattern pieces of the coat or jacket are transferred onto the lining fabric, and with some necessary adjustments, the lining pattern pieces are created. And I'll go a little bit further into this later on in the video. I am using 100% wool tweed as the main fashion fabric for this coat. It is very easy and forgiving to work with, especially for a first tailoring project. Now, the same cannot be said regarding the lining because I went with weighted silk chamois and it has fluid drape, but I have experience working with silk and I wanted to use the very best fabric possible because I knew how much time and effort I'll put into this project. Plus, I would love for this coat to last me a lifetime. So, without further ado, here are the 20 steps it took me to tailor a coat. I hope you enjoy. The wool is folded lengthwise on grain, and then I'm transferring the pattern pieces into 2 layers of fabric. All of the pattern pieces are carefully pinned through the layers and traced to the tailor's tack on the wrong side of the fabric. The seam allowance is currently at 1 inch. I know it's a lot, but it gives me loads of room for adjustments, especially if I decide to make alterations and add ease to the coat in the future. Without lifting the fabric, the pieces are then cut out with a pair of sharp fabric shears. Tailor tacking requires a lot of patience, but it is important and will save you time in the long run. Not only all of the details such as the seam line starts and pockets are marked precisely, but they are marked simultaneously through 2 layers, making them identical so long as the fabric stays put in the process. The pieces are then pulled apart, cut and pressed. And, as it is often mentioned, pressing is just in general a very important practice when it comes to sewing, and in this case it helps the thread fibers stay put as the fabric is handled. If you're sewing welt pockets, addressing them should be one of the first steps in actual garment construction. I've decided to use contrasting fabric for the welt strip. I'm using silk chamois that is interfaced with grosgrain ribbon for structure, which helps to prevent the pocket from stretching over time. The process of creating a double welt pocket is a bit complicated in my mind, to say the least. and difficult to describe without making an actual tutorial or a step-by-step walkthrough. I do know for certain that all of the pocket and button openings need to be temporarily whip stitched edge to edge with silk thread so that the fabric does not lose its shape while the garment is continuing to be worked on. And then the pocket flap. Every piece in a properly tailored coat or jacket requires hands-on interfacing. This is what distinguishes a handmade garment from ready-to-wear, so even the pocket flap needs its structure. I will go more in depth regarding interfacing further in the video. There's a pretty good amount of it. Reshaping the pattern of the flap by creating diagonal seams on the back instead of the edges is especially useful in reducing bulk and heavyweight fabrics such as wool twill. So my flaps are pretty much bulk free now. And this is my kid. I think she's more excited about the flaps than I am. For the lining of the coat in the pockets, I am using suede silk charmeuse. Every seam is first hand basted. It is especially important to do so that no shifting between the two fabric occurs as the amount of layers increase. I am basting through the seam of the double wall pocket, the flap, the lining, and the silk organza pocket stabilizer. This is my second attempt at sewing linings for the pockets. As you will see further in the video, the fabric was initially light blue, but it had too much give and did not work well. I have the tendency to catch stitch everything, whether it needs to or not. When in doubt, catch stitch? To prevent the fabric pieces from losing their shape, the neckline, lapels, and the armhole seams are all stay stitched. I went ahead and sewn single thread running stitch lines along the previously Tailor tacked markings to make it clear and easier for me to work with. Before the fabric pieces are machine sewn together, it is important to hand baste the seams. The pieces are then machine sewn and pressed. Steam and heat can help shape the wool panels along the curved areas such as bust and hips, so long as wool pressing cloth is used. A wool pressing cloth protects the wool fashion fabric and prevents the fibers from flattening. And if you've noticed, I'm trying to lift the iron as much as possible when I press rather than have it slide along the seams or anywhere else on the wool fabric. The canvas interfacing adds shape, definition, structure, and support to the garment. The fiber content is 40% goat hair and 60% wool. You can no longer find canvas without viscose in it, but maybe that's a good thing. It probably all depends on how much structure you would like to achieve. The more viscose content, the less stiff the canvas will likely be. Here, I'm sewing a bias cut shoulder reinforcement directly onto the front canvas interfacing. The pieces are perfectly stacked, the lapel is marked, then basted along the roll line. Canvas and wool front-facing pieces are tailor basted throughout the front of the coat, temporarily holding both fabrics together so that they can be treated as one. A thin tulle tape that is a bit shorter than the roll line is slightly stretched and sewn on to help maintain the shape and prevent stretching. A felling stitch is then used on both edges to hold it in place, and as some can probably tell, the stitches need to be a little bit smaller and a bit more slanted. I'm still learning. Triangular muslin pieces cut on bias are sewn on to further help the collar keep its shape, and then the front of the lapel is pat stitched through both the canvas and wool with that showing on the right side of the fashion fabric. The lapel is rolled over the index finger as tiny parallel pat stitches are sewn on. The tighter the stitches, the more structure you will create. The lapel is further shaped by steam pressing and drying over a folded damp towel, and the excess canvas is then cut 1/8 of an inch within the seam line. To help prevent the edges from stretching, a muslin bias tape is fell stitched near the stitching line along the entire front edge of the coat throughout all of the layers of the fabric, and then catch stitched only to the canvas on the inside. The canvas extends beyond the hemline and is catch stitched along the fold line from underneath. This technique will eventually allow to have a rounded hemline rather than crisp and sharp. I have added 2 vents to the pattern of this coat, and all 4 sides need to be reinforced with cross-grained strips of hair canvas. The strips extend from the top of the vent to the hem fold line. As always, both sides are first tailor basted. Then the half-inch extended garment fabric is folded over the hair canvas at the vent edge, and diagonal stitches are sewn to hold it in place. I then catch stitch the sides of the canvas and the folded garment fabric. The muslin back stays sewn on to stabilize the shoulder area and to provide support to the fashion fabric. The back panel is now stitched to the side panels and basting threads are removed. Oh, and never forget to press. Always use an iron as you sew. Then the separate understructure pieces are attached via the method shown here. And at this point, front facing is ready to be attached to the front piece of the coat. To help the lapel roll nicely and to hide the seam lines along the edge, 1/8 of an inch in width is added to the face of the lapel. It's the attention to details that makes all the difference, which sometimes requires disassembling and starting over and over again. The seams are then pressed open, created along the edge of the coat, and tailor basted through all the layers toward the garment at the lapel area and the face inside past the breaking point. Everything is then pressed and the layers are tailor basted throughout so that the distribution of the front-facing fabric is set in place before it is catch stitched to the raw edge and the lining is finally attached. A 4-inch strip of canvas cut on bias is sewn on with the catch stitch 3 inches away from the basting thread, marking the very edge of the coat. A hidden catch stitch is then used to attach the canvas to the fashion fabric along the basting thread to keep it in place. The coat hem is finally folded up along the hemline and the edge is once again stitched to the interfacing. A soft roll hemline is a preference, and I've applied it to both the bottom edge of the coat and the sleeves. Nothing should be overlooked. Beautiful finishes and nicely sewn hidden pockets are among one of the features you can add to help make the garment appear more polished and authentic. The lining takes a lot of wear and strain, and so the pieces should be slightly larger in both the width and height than the pattern of the coat to prevent pulling and possible future tears in the garment. The lining and coat are matched together at the waistline, pin and basted from neckline to near the top of the vents, around the sleeves, and finally around the neckline. This holds both of the fabrics together at the correct location as everything is permanently stitched. The first area addressed is along the vents. I can't even recall how many times it took me to rework this area. I just couldn't get the lining to lay similarly on both of the vents. The lining front is pinned to the front of the coat and then a hand sewed on with a decorated running stitch using double-stranded silk thread. As mentioned earlier, there is a lot of stitching involved when it comes to tailoring a coat. And the awesome hidden pocket that I am super excited about. It's pretty massive. I'll probably lose all of my belongings in there. Well, at least I'll know where to look. The hem of the lining needs a fold that provides lengthwise ease to the lining, and it's sewn with the hem stitch about an inch above the hem of the coat. The undercollar also requires understructure. Both the wool self fabric and canvas are cut on bias and the center back seams are stitched. On both ends between the wool and canvas, a bias piece of lightweight muslin is sewn on to add body to the collar. The canvas and wool self fabric are pad stitched together in a semicircular pattern. This adds structure to the collar and helps with flexibility in shaping the piece with an iron to conform to the curve of the neck. Here, the tips are stitched rolled over the index finger. This allows the collar corners to incline downward toward the shoulder. The semicircular line created out of tiny parallel stitches will direct and further support the area where the collar folds. Canvas that lies past the seam allowance is trimmed away. The seam for the fashion fabric is trimmed to 3/8 of an inch on the neck edge, folded, pressed, basted, and then catch stitched to the canvas. The upper collar is larger than the under collar. The fullness is eased in, and both are carefully pinned and hem basted together. The seams are stitched. Unnecessary basting thread is removed, and then properly pressed as usual. The rest of the seam allowance is graded and sewn flat against the canvas with cat stitches. The collar is then flipped and then tailor basted 1/4 of an inch away from the seamed edges. This is a 2-piece set and sleeve with vents, or more like a 4-piece set in my case because the seam is dividing the upper portion of the sleeve from the bottom. I am currently working on the bottom portion of the sleeve. The process of creating the vents here is very similar to how they were constructed on the back of the coat. Both of the edges are interfaced with 2-inch wide cross-grain strips of hair canvas. The edge of the wool is folded over and attached with the usual catch stitch. Then additional diagonal stitches reinforce the edge of the canvas in place. The stitches, as always, should be invisible on the right side of the coat. And then my favorite soft wool hemline is created. I'm also sewing basting stitches that serve as a guide which indicates where to attach the lining. The silk lining is sewn onto the coat with lengthwise ease in order to prevent tension, and a tiny hem stitch will hold the two fabrics together. The side edges of the lining fabric are then folded back and are permanently attached with silk thread to the sleeve by a tiny running stitch. The bottom and upper sleeves are now ready to be attached. They are first pinned at appropriate location and basted, machine sewn together, and obviously pressed per usual. The seam holding both pieces together is graded to reduce bulk and catch stitch to keep it in place. And then finally, the upper and under sleeve linings are basted, machine sewn, pressed, and are ready to be attached to the main sleeve with yet another tiny hem stitch. The length of the back shoulder seam is half an inch longer than the front. This provides additional room for the curve of the back and the shoulder blade area. Before stitching the shoulder seams, a strip of muslin is used to reinforce the front shoulder area. With the help of careful steaming, rippling is eliminated while retaining the all-important ease in the shoulder. And to prevent the garment fabric from stretching in that area, the shoulder seam should not be steamed more than 3/4 of an inch past the stitching line. In order to prevent stretching, the armhole is also reinforced with a strip of muslin. The armhole requires ease for movement, no more than 3/8 of an inch to be exact. It is basted into the strip and tacked. A 3-inch wide strip of mohair cut on bias is flushed with the cutting edge of the armhole and stretched as it is sewn on. In addition to eliminating the need for gathering stitches, this also provides a beautiful and smooth form to the sleeve cap once everything is assembled. Shoulder pads are sewn in, followed by the sleeves, which are first hand basted to the garment and then machine sewn. The lining of the shoulder seams, the sleeves, and the armhole of the lining are all brought together with a tiny invisible hand stitch. So, a very quick introduction here. So often there's a straight seam in the back of the coat which leads to a vent if there is one. There also needs to be a seam on the lining and a pleat because of lining fabric access along the neckline and the waistline. It's decoratively stitched through all the layers here and here, but I did not take into account that I have two curved seams running down the back. They began at the armhole, which makes things even more so complicated. So I ignored that part and just went ahead and created two small pleats at the shoulder area alone and left the lining fabric at the waistline as is. Setting the collar is the very last step in assembling the coat. The neckline is reinforced. Final lining stitches are made. And the undercollar is carefully matched to the notches to the back of the coat, pinned, basted, and then securely slip-stitched with thick silk thread. the back neckline seam allowances all go into the collar to help prevent bulk and create a strong seam. It is all diagonally stitched in place. All of the raw edges really around and under collar are basted into place as the assembly is happening, so pretty much everything is secured. I then temporarily pad stitched through the collar for safe measures and finished the gorge seam by hand, joining the lapel facing and the top collar together with a tiny invisible stitch. And finally, the remaining folded seam allowance of the top collar is attached to the neckline of the coat with a tiny slip stitch. I watched a tutorial on YouTube that was extremely helpful in creating hands-on buttonholes, and it was said that it takes about 100 buttonholes before you can sew a decent one. So here I am, only 20 buttonholes in and out of patience, sewing on the real fashion fabric. I am now sewing with regular silk thread through the layers of the fabric to hold everything in place and prevent fraying. I was able to find silk cording which gives the buttonholes body and shape. Silk thread that is suitable for outerwear is then used to sew around the cording, and gradually the shape of the buttonhole takes place. I wanted to give my buttons a rounder, puffier shape, and so I've lined the outer silk fabric with wool. And this part is pretty self-explanatory, I think. This is possibly the most satisfying part yet when it comes to tailoring a coat, removing all of the basting threads. Oh, and just as a side note, the belt that you will soon see on the back of the coat is created exactly the same way of creating the flaps for the pockets, so diagonal seams in the back and hair canvas interfacing. Now for the buttons. In true bespoke tailoring, there is no such thing as simply decorative buttons. Every button needs a buttonhole. So yes, I have buttonholes in the half belt.